tactics, and boy, do we have a show for you.
We do every week, don't we?
I don't, well, I don't think we can put on nearly as big a show as our illustrious vice president did at the Munich conference since the last time we started recording.
I'm in tears.
So, to recap some of our claims, one, oh gosh, now I'm brain farting on them. Pete, what were some of the things we said about the war in Ukraine?
That the situation on the front line was going to lead to a negotiated settlement being a top priority of the current administration. That the Ukrainians could always just choose to continue fighting, but that could lead to the United States just essentially saying, here you go, that's the deal. And then the Russians obviously being very hard-nosed about no NATO for Ukraine, and probably also no U.S. troops in Ukraine for whatever the DMZ is going to look like. I was not anticipating the mineral rights thing, though, that's currently getting kicked around. And I also was definitely not anticipating that President Zelensky was going to essentially kind of call out President Trump on Twitter and then
Oh, they kind of got in a little bit of a cat fight, didn't they?
They got in a flame war. I was not anticipating that. If I was Zelensky, that was actually the absolute last thing I would want to be doing in this situation.
That's exactly what JD Vance said too. Like,
yeah.
Are you serious? It's not like
yes.
he's never been president before. Surely you know what is a good or not good way of approaching President Trump.
Again, everyone just needs to look at the Japanese. The Japanese know how to talk to President Trump. Like, there's never drama. There's never any issues. It's the Japanese, man. They come without fanfare and everyone leaves happy every single time.
So, you mentioned the mineral rights thing, but let's just summarize things where they stand and then we'll kind of just play it by ear from there. Mm-hmm. So at the Munich conference, we had two different things happen, right? One we talked about a little bit already, which was outside of the conference proceedings themselves. Secretary of Defense Hegseth mentioned that when getting realistic about finding a solution for the war in Ukraine, or ending the war rather, you can definitely expect that Ukraine is not going to have their 2014 borders restored. It's just not realistic.
Yep.
And from a practical standpoint, it's fairly accurate to say in order to have a claim to that land, they probably would have needed to push through and be holding it. Like, possession is 9/10 of the law, as it were.
I'd say it's 10 out of 10 in international relations, but yeah.
Yeah. And the second one was that Ukraine would never join NATO. Mm-hmm. I find that one a little less certain, because
we can always change our mind on that pretty quick.
We've said things like that before, but also there's something to be said even now after folks have spun up their spending. Like, the bulk of NATO's might is really carried by the United States at this point in time. Like, there is no mutual dependency. It's pretty much codependency on Europe at this time. Codependency of Europe on the United States through NATO at this time.
Yep.
And I think and I'm bringing this up now because I wanted us to sort of rehash Vice President Vance's comments a little bit after that, because this is an important context to bring up, because nobody's really brought it up before, like, meaningfully, like, and just been like, listen, why don't you stop and pause what you're doing and think for a second about the leverage that we might have on you, right? It's all fun and games. We talked previously about U.S. relationships with Taiwan and other junior partners. The U.S. generally lets anybody say whatever they want to about us, unless you're Canada and playing hockey, because that happened this week too. Yep. Oh my goodness.
3 fist fights in the first 10 seconds, I believe.
3 seconds. I think it was 3 seconds. Yeah. 6 people in the penalty box 10 seconds into the game.
That was a hockey moment.
But it all speaks to a sort of like entitled behavior based around what the U.S. has previously done.
Yep.
And the U.S. is clearly trying to undo a lot of precedents that have been established and trying to break out of a mold that it clearly hasn't sat well into at this time. And so normally it lets people say whatever they want to say, antagonistic or otherwise. Mm-hmm. But clearly there's something changing here, because Europe has a lot of longstanding partnerships with the United States. And J.D. Vance brought up a really valid point where there's clearly a values drift, where we're looking at you across the pond and we're not recognizing what we had in common anymore, unless
Yep.
you're Poland. I feel like he probably could have made things even better or a heck of a lot worse by saying, "Except you, Poland."
Oh yeah. Well, Hegseth actually says as much in Warsaw the next day. Like, oh, you're our strongest ally. All right. We
Well,
share
I
the
mean,
values.
the EU's been complaining about Poland's behaviors, which have really largely been what America's doing now: border protection, securing more defense, a little
Mm-hmm.
bit, a little bit resistant to globalization opinions.
Mm-hmm. More relatively socially conservative for Europe. Relatively socially conservative.
And so this speech was just absolutely shocking because I think it rang home a moment where Europe thought America, the United States, was on the same page, tariff
Mm-hmm.
wars or whatever. That and I don't think they realized. I
No,
don't think they
exactly. It's
realized
like no,
the
not only yeah,
divorce. It was
yeah,
like everybody was following a playbook until it was like, guys, we don't know what you're doing anymore.
yeah. This isn't the Europe that was. This isn't the Europe of the 1980s, right, or the 90s even.
And so it was really interesting to see that he was talking about the threats from within, and like to credit the administration, right? That clearly the United States also views its own threats from within as well.
Mm-hmm.
More specifically, with trying to lock down the border, the ICE raids, and other things going on, and just like getting your internal house in order and protecting free speech have become prominent, and also just clearing out corruption or waste or fraud, waste, and abuse and things like that. And so he wasn't necessarily only speaking at Munich just to Europe. I think a lot of it fits very well into the context of what the administration has been working at a blinding speed to do right now. And that being said, that sort of brings us up to this position on the Ukraine war. Personally, Pete, I think the money that we're saving and this new planned budget cuts, because I guess Secretary Hegseth took our advice from last week's episode
Amazing
and
how much he
started
really is.
increasing
Thank
budget
you,
cuts.
Secretary, for being first guaranteed listener.
Yeah, which we can have no way of confirming or denying, of course, but it's
We'll get a
it's nice to
testimonial
see
up
that.
on the website.
But yeah, so just in the background of this, Secretary Hegseth has announced 8% budget cuts for the next few years for the
Yeah,
Department of Defense.
year over year. So for the
Yeah,
next 5 years, 8%, so a 40% total cut to the DoD.
I think it'll be interesting. But this goes into this context of the Ukraine war, right? I think I've said this a few times. I think the aid money and resources are well spent going to Ukraine because deferring from some of the accusations that were levied against Europe, Ukraine is currently actively fighting to defend itself.
Yep.
And so, whereas with not participating fully in NATO as agreed, if you're not going to defend yourself, Europe, why should the United States stake your defense for you? That doesn't seem reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine is, in fact, trying to defend its own democracy, and Russia's always kind of been antagonistic to U.S. interests, and so I think that the money that's like that military labeled money. That's some of the best military spending we've been doing for 20 odd years.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I would say on top of that, the money given to the Israelis for the last year after they've just
Yeah, that's
whooped
something
the Iranians up and down the Levant.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And so I personally think that war is tragic and that nobody ought to make a war go on perpetually. But at the same time, I personally believe that if Ukraine, and meaningfully Ukraine, not just Zelensky, since we have some accusations or Russian propaganda being thrown around there, depending on who you listen to, is
Yep.
willing to fight for it. I think that it's perfectly money well spent to continue fighting for it.
Yep. But from the
But then,
administration's position, though, right? Everything has to be examined in the context of China, right? So, like, it's like essentially, it's like, well, and how is this war helping us compete with China? And so, if the calculus is that we would rather the Russians not be continued to get drained and become more reliant upon the Chinese, right? So, like, this war is pushing, as we discussed, I think, another episode. The Russians have become they're leaning so heavily on the Chinese now because they're the only people who can trade with them or supply them with semiconductors.
mm-hmm.
So how long can this war realistically go on? Like, are we just going to continue bleeding the Russians white and Ukraine white, and like, I mean, and see how long they'll both be able to last, or do we basically like cut it off now? The lessons been learned or whatever, and now try to turn this is how I'm picturing the administration strategy. Now try to basically turn the Russians away from Eastern Europe and maybe back towards Central Asia or something like that, so we can kind of normalize. Notice the normalization, by the way, that was announced on I think Saturday or Sunday between Secretary Rubio and Sergei Lavrov from the Russians. We're going to reopen the embassies. All right, that was the only thing that was decided. The negotiations themselves haven't done it, but this normalization, I think, is part of this whole like, man, it's like the Cold War all over again, man. It's like they're trying to play the China card, but the China card is now the Russia card because the Russia's now the weaker of the three parties. Now, of course, we all know how well the China card worked out in real life, but these are two different situations. China in the 70s was a rising power. Russia now is a declining power. Its demography is a mess. Its economy is in shambles. I don't see much of a future for it, to be honest, unless they start magically reversing their birth rate.
I just, because I think by bleeding the Russians, you're tying up Chinese resources as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because both
Possibly.
sides of this conflict are basically being almost held up by proxy at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not even the only. Are we even technically the prime mover for Ukraine, or like
In
how much?
terms of material and aid, yeah, 100%. We I
Okay,
think we supply about 50-60%, and then the Europeans combined supply, I think, about like 40-ish, and then the Japanese and the South Koreans and the others. The South Koreans aren't sending any aid; they're just they're selling stuff, but the East Asians kind of fill up the rest.
got it. Is definitely having a downstream effect on China, but I don't know. I don't really see, especially if you're trying to squeeze mineral rights out of it. I just don't see, unless we're squeezing mineral rights out of Russia for the Ukrainian territory they now hold
I
too.
feel like it's very odd. It's a very odd thing to be arguing about because like the exploitation of those minerals are decades in the future, man. Like there has to be minefields that need to be cleared, infrastructure needs to be rebuilt. Like it looks like the surface of the moon in the Donbass right now. It's not like we're just going to snap our fingers and walk into a De Beers diamond mine outside of Melitopol. It's I don't know, that part kind of strikes me as odd and not terribly realistic.
So,
It's also annoyingly, it reminds me annoyingly of that stupid Russian propaganda line where they're like, oh yeah, well, Ukraine is very rich in natural resources. Like, not really, dude. Like a lot of people are saying this stuff, but trust me, if the Soviets didn't start extracting it, I don't really know if it's actually there in that amount. It was just another excuse for the Russians to go into Donbass.
and so my outside the box theory for how this all fits into a single strategic narrative, right? I'm gonna call it bald eagle diplomacy. It
And
is
China with a Y.
it's the American version of wolf warrior diplomacy is what I think. And in this narrative, we don't actually the United States foreign policy doesn't really get affected one way or another where the line for Ukraine versus Russia is drawn at the end of this war. The
Okay.
power comes from being the dominant influence and actually bringing this war to an end in very short order after the inauguration.
Oh yeah, yeah, I agree. It's a
And
similar thing about the hostage situation in Israel.
and I think that is would be signaling a narrative power move, showing that America is back. This is America's world, and just sort of like I'm being hyperbolic here, like this is America's world and you're living in it, China,
I
and
mean,
and so that's what.
the meeting in Riyadh, to be honest, I'm sure the Poles were reminded deeply of the Yalta conference because you have the Americans and the Russians meeting bilaterally to discuss the fate of essentially borders being drawn in Eastern Europe bilaterally. Because like again, like who the heck else are you going to invite to this conference? Like everyone forgets, like at Yalta, Churchill got left out in the cold, man. That was FDR and Stalin making the deals. The British were not freaking invited to the talks. You can't have these three-way talks at these high levels. It has to be bilateral. If you bring in more people, it just muddies the water.
And arbitrarily redrawing lines in Eastern Europe or really in anywhere in the world for that matter has never really ended well for anybody either. So I don't think this is the last time we're going to be studying a conflict in this part of the world, and specifically between Russia and Ukraine.
Yep. Well, I mean, to be honest, the lines drawn by Yalta were pretty freaking permanent. I mean, because it was aided by a lot of ethnic cleansing at the same time.
Where are those lines now?
The same lines. Yalta is the lines of modern Europe. The only things that have changed are the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Transnistria and Moldova, and then Czechoslovakia splitting in half. Those are the only changes to Yalta since 45.
So Kosovo was decided
Oh,
at the Alta.
Yugoslavia is their no, Yugoslavia is a Wilson thing, dude. That was
I'm
Wilson's
just
split.
I'm but this is just it's just a trend. Like all of the most contentious points of the globe are ones where the lines have been drawn.
Yes, but the thing is, a lot of those contentious points didn't have mass ethnic cleansing, moving populations out. Right? Like there's very little conflict along the Polish-Ukrainian border because all the Poles on the Ukrainian side got either killed or expelled, just like all the Germans who lived in what is now western and northern Poland.
I mean, granted, that's a more permanent solution,
Yeah, it's the permanent
or
solution,
or the
actually.
only permanent solution for that matter. Yeah,
Yeah, that's
but like
it's wild.
as a general rule of thumb, that has less to do with where you drew the line and more to do with who's living inside of which lines that you've already drawn.
That's what happens, dude. Like, look at the partition of India. Like I said, the same thing happens. The lines are drawn, and then there's mass population expulsion. Where you get the issue is when you draw the line, like you do a Sykes-Picot, where you draw the line straight through, and then there's no population movement. That's when fires start,
Yeah,
brewing.
because the borders ultimately don't matter. It's the people that are living within them.
Yep, yep. And unless
Uh,
they are oddly friendly with each other, like Czechs and Slovaks, you're going to get tension.
One other thing I did want to bring up because I was thinking about it today. I can't remember if somebody mentioned it to me or what. And I am by no means a Russian propagandist expert, Pete. But how many times has the United States suspended presidential elections?
Oh, I mean, pretty amazing that we had them in the middle of the Civil War.
Yeah, we've
Did you know
had
that?
them through every war,
Did you know
territorial
that
sovereignty challenged or not.
Did you know that like Tennessee and Louisiana both, crazy coincidence, voted for Lincoln because they were under military governments in the fall of 64?
It's more important that we
Isn't that
had the
wild?
election.
My boy General Butler down there counting the electoral votes in occupied New Orleans. Yep, another successful win for the Republicans. But yes, that was what we call a fortified election, in the parlance of 2020, a fortified and fair election.
It was just something interesting to think about with President Trump's accusations towards Zelensky vis-a-vis him supposedly
Now,
suspending elections for nefarious purposes.
difference being, when we were holding our elections in 64, the North was not about a third of the North was not occupied by a foreign power, so it was a
Well, half
little
of
bit
America
different.
was occupied by a foreign power at that
Yeah,
point.
well, yeah, but those guys didn't send their votes, obviously. But yeah. I guess that is a fair point.
You can, well,
It's
right. I mean, you still like you don't get around the whole existential threat at that point. Like
legit.
the
That's like one of
the,
those things.
the
Like, I'm not
people living
American.
living
I'm
in the
not.
Donetsk moon crater wouldn't have been casting too many votes in the Ukrainian election either.
Well, neither were people in Atlanta, Georgia in 64. Sorry about that, Georgians. I'm not an American exceptionalist, but that's like legit, dude. The November 1864 election, that is like a dang, America. That's pretty impressive. I understand the Confederacy was kind of on the ropes by then. Things were sort of collapsing, but like, and the war was basically over, but like, still pretty dang impressive. And then obviously we had one in the middle of World War II in the middle of World War II. No, just one, because 40 and then 44. So yeah, that was pretty cool. Imagine that, having an election in the middle of World War II, 1944. That's pretty amazing.
And the only other thing I was thinking we'd talk about today was brought by our other listener who isn't Secretary Hegseth,
Your
and that was
mom
to
or,
talk.
or my mom?
My mom doesn't listen to this anymore, dude. She listened to like the first one.
Oh, we got to bring her back. We need
Uh,
we need to double our listener base.
Initiative,
Ah, from my brother. That
yeah,
was a really good one.
yeah, because just the role of initiative.
Shout out to Dr. Andrew Mitchell, by the way. The best bro. He likes to listen while he's lifting weights. Hopefully he doesn't drop anything on his head.
So let's pull the question up for context. But I wanted to link this. So initiative is an important concept in strategy and winning, right? So in J.C. Wiley's power control theory, right, there's this idea that all wars are based around trying to obtain some measure of power over your adversary.
Yep.
And the way you do that is by actually exerting force on them. And
Hmm.
you keep exerting force until they've mounted a defense where they are able to push back. And at some point, just like we see in the Russia-Ukraine war now, you reach this basically equilibrium. And the only way to upset this sort of stalemate is to get around it, is to find a new way to exploit something. And that's when you can regain the initiative and keep building momentum again. And so, at face value, it seems like seizing the initiative is always the way that you win a war, but that's not necessarily the case, and it's not necessarily required in a matter of strategy either. Because if you compare Israel to the United States, right? Israel, they they are kind of a shoot first, ask questions never mentality,
Ask
and
for permission, never either.
and the reason they are like that is almost by geographic necessity. They're just
Yep.
not big enough, and they don't have enough nearby friends to be willing to give somebody the opportunity to hit them first.
Yep. Known as
Whereas,
the siege mentality is, I think, the
right,
technical term for it.
as President Trump sort of taunted, right? We have this big, beautiful, wide ocean between us and Europe. Like Russia's not really a threat to us, and and a lot of that's true. We can see a lot of different kinds of threats coming as from the United States' perspective than other people can. So we can afford to not throw the first punch.
Hmm.
And usually when we've thrown our first punch in most conflicts, it has not landed well.
Nope.
It takes us
Battle
a
of the
minute to
Coral Sea
figure out.
was not great.
Yeah, it takes us a minute to figure out how this next battle is going to go down again, unless we're fighting Canada in a hockey rink.
Yeah, we showed no mercy.
Yeah, dude, that was so wild. Anyway, I don't even watch hockey.
Apparently, the Finland Sweden game was also very good. Those are also two countries that have a nice rivalry.
But getting back to the point, so the United States doesn't really need the initiative. They pay a cost for not taking that initiative, but what we lack in initiative, we generally make up for in unrelenting momentum.
Once
So
it's built up. Yeah.
right. So there's a gradual build up, and then once it's built up, it's just basically nigh on unstoppable.
Hmm.
And so initiative isn't necessarily that important, but I bring it up because when he asked that question, I was also reading through the transcript for Vice President Vance's speech at the Munich conference, and and that's immediately what we just disrupted an equilibrium between the EU and the US. Like I don't know whether relations will change or not immediately or overnight, but I don't think Europe was prepared for notes that were quite that pointed or articulate,
Yep.
and I think we're going to see that catalyze some things, whether it's among the peoples of these various countries or potentially among the administrations of those people themselves. But I I think that speech, one, it was an awesome speech, but two, just the timing and presentation of it was brilliant enough to put the spotlight back on the U.S. As a stronger, grounded contender for global leadership and
No.
influence.
You could say also like civilizational leader, right? Like it's saying like no, like this is like you other guys in the West. This is not You're not doing what the West is all about, and we're going to show you what it's supposed to look like, right? There's a Huntingtonian aspect to it, right? It's that's what a civilizational leader
We
does.
made it 4 episodes before you brought old Sam back into this.
You don't feel mashallah, brother, right? It's like you got to think about it that way too. It's a total dominance move, like you said.
The narrative, as long as I've been in the military, I feel like the narrative has been America is sick, America is frail, America is crumbling, America
Yeah.
is weak,
Hmm.
China's star is on the rise.
America's very decadent. You know what I mean? A
Yeah.
crumbling republic.
And in one speech, I feel like Vice President Vance went over there and upset the apple cart a lot of ways on those things. It also definitely helps with that Doge is going through at the same time, and so people are seeing this massive switch turn on overnight, which is wild. Because the other thing, like the momentum that we've seen build over this, like the rapidness and volatility of these changes coming,
Yeah.
this is stuff we've only ever seen the America accomplish in times of war. Like
Yeah. Actually, I
there's
would say that.
nothing
Yeah.
nothing the Americans are just generally disunited, and that doesn't have to be a bad thing because that's just how it is. Like the states all had rivalries with each others going back to ye olden days when they were just gentlemanly farmers with their own little homesteads.
Yep.
States had rivalries. It was all about this state or that state. And then somebody boos the national anthem, and it just immediately, it's like going to an Irish wedding, right?
Yeah.
Like
We're all enemies until
everybody's
somebody
getting
says the
called
wrong
names
thing.
until somebody calls your cousin a name, and then all the cousins are now mad at you. Like, no, you don't get to call him that.
Yep. 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 That's it. Oh, and again, like, where's the public outcry? Like, people keep trying to drum up this outcry against whatever the cuts to the federal workforce, the cuts to the budget. There's no outcry. There is no outcry because I think people like it. You have to
I
look at the approval ratings. Like,
the counter arguments are just very thin against it too. Like
yeah,
they
oh,
don't.
people will lose their jobs. Like, okay,
Well,
I'm
even
sorry.
that most of it's like, well, why does Elon Musk get to do this? And I'm like, well, technically, Elon Musk is really just doing it so that the president doesn't have to come down there himself. Like he's an extension of the president's will. It's a very common concept.
Yeah, yep.
But it's like it's all focused around he shouldn't do this. Nobody voted for him. You can't do this. They need to spend that money. And but there's no substance behind it. Like
Yeah,
there hasn't been a lot of credible, meaningful pushback. And
because
I
no one
think
can point to it. You can't, and you can't.
it's
There's,
hard to
yeah.
justify some of these things spending. Like when food prices are this high, should we really be buying $50 million worth of condoms for a county in a country that is 3 continents away?
Hmm.
It's
Everything gets put under the microscope now. It's like, what's the purpose of this? What's the purpose of this? What exactly do you say you do here?
I've I've been meaning to make Grace rewatch Office Space with me just
Yeah,
because of Doge going around.
it is like,
I
oh, we're
keep
about to fix the glitch. We're gonna
I
fix the
keep
glitch.
I
These
keep
problems will
waiting
take care of themselves.
I keep waiting for a 19-year-old with a next gen looking iPad with a Tesla logo on the back to come into my office and start asking questions.
Yep.
Like,
Well, like I make syllabi, and then I talk to the cadets about stuff on the syllabi, and then I grade them occasionally. I also take attendance. I take attendance in their class.
I write part of the contracts and hand it to the procurements people so that the procurements
Yeah.
people don't
Oh,
need
so
to talk to my boss about the contracts.
do you actually do those procurements though, Joe? Well, no, the procurements people do the
But
procurements.
I need to be able to talk the procurements to my boss.
Oh, it's all fun and games until they come and fire us. Oh, actually,
It's
though, for
not.
real, yeah, for I think the particular institution we work at will be heavily targeted as well as several others. Did we ever do an episode on like why the federal service academies exist in this day and age?
No, but I'd be willing to do that because
Yeah, because that's a
I've sort
topic
of been
you're always
question.
very willing to talk my ear off
Well,
about.
listen, like Thomas Jefferson wrote it
For
into
a peace be
existence.
upon him, that is your alma mater.
Right. He wrote it into existence, but at the same time, ROTC wasn't a thing back then. And it's literally written like on the wall in Clark Gym in there on how he felt about physical fitness and military service. It's like he thought everybody needed 2 years of education on how to serve in a militia in order to be able to, like, he literally, if somebody had said, do you want to do this, President Jefferson, or would you rather start funding reserve officer training programs, he would have gone with the reserve officer training programs. He hated centralizing anything. That was the whole reason him and Hamilton never got along. But anyways,
But if he had seen the Blandenburg races in 1812, he would have changed his mind on the militia.
Hold on though. Circling back to my earlier point about initiative, seizing the initiative and America moving at this rate of change, and you only see that in times of war. I was trying to link that back into Vice President Vance's speech too,
Mhm.
because like in some ways, like this insider threat he talked about for Europe that we've also been addressing in America, it very much it's that dire. It's existential.
Yep.
It's existential, and we've as a people kind of just like accepted it because like what can you do? It's the government. It has power. You
Hmm.
actually need somebody to go in there and be willing to give up some power or some money in order to change things. And so it's really fascinating. I
It
feel
is.
like it's like somebody cursed us with the whole "may you live in interesting times" thing, but so far it's not that bad. It's just
So
actually
far.
genuinely interesting.
Yeah. And like I said, and that's another thing. Is like there's no actual coherent resistance because all you're going to hear from people who are opposing this is, "Oh well, just wait, more planes are going to crash." Like just wait. Like all they're saying is like, "Oh, the other shoe is gonna drop," and that's not how you motivate people into anything. Like distant, ambiguous threats like that, right? That's not how you galvanize a base.
I think the Democratic Party, not to get too political, but I do think the Democratic Party needs to relook at how they brand and message their stances, or maybe just sort of do a strategic deep dive on some of the assumptions that they held to be true.
Well, they can ask the new vice chairman, right? David Hogg. He's a smart guy.
I was more interested to see what's going to happen here with the New York congestion tax for Manhattan and President Trump through the Department of Transportation
I
trying
thought
to
it got thrown
dismantle
out.
that. Kathy Hochul is countersuing or suing rather. The governor of
How's
New
that going
York
to work?
is I don't
How does the
I
state have
don't
authority over the Department of Transportation?
I don't know the specifics. I was just more dumbfounded that the
Oh,
people
so
of
now
New
they like
York
states' rights.
I just
Now they like states'
I'm
rights.
just dumbfounded that the people of New York didn't start immediately lighting things on fire because the tax burden up here is just so unbelievably high already. And you're going to do that? Like, the plumbers aren't going to be able to afford to go deal with the century and a half old infrastructure that is on Manhattan.
Well,
And was just
isn't
going to,
Kathy Hochul also trying to get? Isn't she trying to remove the mayor of New York City too?
yeah, but he did some bad things. So
Well, yeah. But I've never heard of that happening before either. When's the last time a governor pulled a mayor?
I don't know, but she was on the metro or the subway 2 or 3 weeks ago, making this announcement of how the subway is so much safer and cleaner, and something related to the congestion tax, and how the subway they restored safety to the subway, and like 7 stops away or something, a woman got lit on fire, like literally while she was giving this speech.
Again? Or is this was this the same lady that got lit on
That was
fire?
the same lady, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Literally happened at the same time she was doing a press conference on the subway about how safe it was.
That one didn't age quite so well.
I'm I try not to get too political, but I just really don't like New York.
It's all right. You're a Southerner. You're entitled to your incorrect opinions.
I am. I'm gonna be sad when I have to give up my Georgia driver's license when I move away.
But you're a Virginian.
Yeah, but I mean, I bought a home in Georgia. I lived in both duty stations that matter in Georgia.
Bad is the kudzu down there.
Oh, it's everywhere.
Okay.
It's just like your green miles driving up 95 or 80, 85 or wherever else. It's just one massive carpet.
It's so
Like
apocalyptic.
you no, yeah, you don't see trees. You just don't. It's just the kudzu.
Jeez Louise.
Listen,
Oh.
it's technically edible. You can make clothes out of it. It's a very sustainable. Somebody's going to figure out a really creative way of upcycling that stuff and make a killing,
All
because you
right.
can harvest that crap for free since it's an invasive species.
Well, that's the American way of doing things. Just get
I
the
need to
incentive
hire
out
a smart kid who can design some sort of 3D printer that can work with kudzu
there.
fibers.
A kudzu printer.
Yes.
That would be pretty cool.
All right. Well, that's a good one. Uh,
Yep. I think that was good, and we'll just wait for another week until a bunch more interesting things happen that we'll have
Yeah,
to discuss.
like usually we have to throw in a filler episode here or there where we talk about some obscure military language that folks may or may not have, but like this one we didn't even have a cocktail convo for because there was just it's already too many conversations out there happening that were super fascinating.
Man, something else, dude. It's like you got to turn off news notifications now. This gets too much.
But what you shouldn't do is turn off your notification that you have a new episode available from Brass Tactics. You never
Don't
want
forget
to
to
do
like and
that.
subscribe, and tell your friends,
And please
especially
tell your friends.
your parents. Tell your parents too. That means two new listeners. Thank you.
Ba da ba ba da ba.